I want to bring in Niall Stanage now. He is a White House columnist for The Hill. Niall, thanks so much for being with us. First of all, what are you hearing from White House officials coming back from this summit about the president's Helsinki performance?
Well, I mean, as always, there's something of a difference between the public-facing response and the private response. In public, they're talking about things like the president being willing to take political risks for diplomacy. But to be candid, nobody really believes that. I was speaking with members of President Trump's orbit, I'll say, in the last 24 hours. They were using words like embarrassing, like ugly, talking about the idea that this was a real problem for the president. So there is clearly deep unease, even among people who are loyal to the president.
It's going to be some damage control for sure. Now, Niall, the president tweeted that while he had a great meeting with NATO, he had an even better meeting with Vladimir Putin. So do we know what exactly came of it from a policy standpoint?
No, we don't. And the reason that we don't is because the two leaders met one-to-one, apart from interpreters. There were not the officials that are normally at these kind of meetings. There was some talk in the press conference about some areas where perhaps Russia and the United States could work together, issues like Syria or counter-terrorism, but really very little detail. And of course, everything else has been swallowed up by this firestorm over the way President Trump spoke.
So we haven't been able to glean any details at all on what happened in that 2-hour private meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin with just their interpreters. No information yet about what they spoke about for 2 hours.
Certainly, to the best of my knowledge, there has been no specific information offered about that. I mean, for example, at the press conference, it was left to Vladimir Putin to suggest that President Trump had raised objections to the annexation of Crimea. There seems to have been some conversation about the election meddling, but that, as I say, is part of this broader controversy.
All right. I want to play what former acting CIA Director Mike Morell had to say on CBS this morning. Let's listen.
I do think that senior officials in the intelligence community need to ask themselves whether they can continue to serve this president and represent the men and women of the intelligence community in a way that is positive. Deeply concerned about that.
Would you advise them to step down if they reached out to you for advice?
I would advise them to consider stepping down, yes.
To consider stepping down. Now, Niall, others have called for senior administration officials to resign. But here's my question to you. If administration officials resign, who would be safeguarding our intelligence?
That's the argument, and that's the argument that has been made throughout the Trump administration, that even people who may not agree with the president's overall ideology or may not be sympathetic to his rather volatile way of dealing with global matters should get in there as forces of restraint. But it is made very difficult for them. One only has to think of someone like Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence, who has been emphatic about the fact that Russia meddled and may be engaged in other kinds of cyber espionage, and has had that opinion dismissed by the President of the United States in favour of the denial put forth by the President of the Russian Federation.
Here's a hypothetical question for you in light of all that we've been discussing. If intelligence leaders were to determine that something very dangerous was happening and the president did not seem to be capable of stemming it, what responsibility would they have with that, to do with that information?
That is a really difficult question. Clearly, the president is commander-in-chief. Right. They could go to other senior members of the administration and try to go through them to really enforce upon the president or to really make clear to him the gravity of the situation. But ultimately, he's the commander-in-chief. The buck does stop there.
Right. All right. Niall, many Republican lawmakers have condemned the president's remarks in Helsinki, as we've been speaking about, and expressed their support for the intelligence community. But there's been mixed reaction on what to do about it. I want to play what Speaker Ryan had to say this morning.
Here's what we have already done, and here's what we could continue to do, which is to put sanctions on Russia. You just saw the indictments from the special counsel. Those GRU officers, I've already seen the intelligence. They were the people that conducted this cyber attack on our elections. We'd already put in place sanctions. If the financial if the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Financial Services Committee and the Senate Banking Committee think that there are other sanctions that we have not yet placed upon Russia, I'm more than happy to consider those.
So he, of course, would not go so far as to call the president's actions treasonous, but there has been a tidal wave of criticism from the president's own party. How do you anticipate the Trump administration would respond to Republican congressional oversight on this?
Not very well. There has been tension between the Trump White House and Republicans on Capitol Hill since the inception of this administration. I guess the silver lining for the Trump administration is that I'm not sure that kind of standoff is going to happen. We have seen Republicans criticize the president on other occasions, but they have been rather reluctant to do anything about it. He has support levels of about 90% with Republican voters. So yes, you do see these criticisms. The Weekly Standard, a conservative magazine, was calling for a formal vote of censure in the president. But really, I would be very surprised to see that happen, Tanya.
All right. We've been focusing until now on Republican criticism, but of course there was criticism from the Democrats as well. Senator Minority Leader Chuck Schumer on the floor of the Senate today calling for congressional action in response to yesterday's summit and questioned whether Putin has something on Trump. Is this a rallying cry Democrats should use heading into the 2018 midterms?
It's a great question. It is clearly a rallying cry that would engage and energize the Democratic base. The counter-argument has always been that voters are concerned with kitchen table issues, with jobs, with wages, healthcare, education, all of those topics. So the danger is that it becomes an overreach by Democrats, but clearly it is important to keep their own base fired up, particularly in midterm elections where Democratic voters, or the demographic blocs that tend to vote Democratic, have turned out less reliably than Republican-leaning blocs.
Absolutely. Niall Stanage, thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Tanya.